Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled The 5 Requirements for External Attack Surface Management. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items to keep in mind. First of all, today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on demand shortly after the broadcast. Secondly, anyone from the audience can ask a question during today's live broadcast by clicking on the questions button on the right-hand side of the BrightTalk web application. We'll save about 10 minutes at the end to answer any questions from the audience. Finally, we'll send over the slides from today's webinar afterward in case you may be interested in revisiting these on your own time. Now let's get started. My name is Ryan Powell. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing at CyCognito, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Rob Gurzeev, who's our CEO and co-founder. Thank you for joining us today, Rob. We look forward to your discussion.
Yeah, looking forward to it too. Thank you, Ryan. And glad that you guys joined. Very quickly about myself. So CEO and co-founder of CyCognito today, spent the last 15 years or so in offensive cybersecurity and reconnaissance. Amongst other things, I had the privilege to lead the reconnaissance department of one of the top intelligence agencies. And just for everyone's context, reconnaissance in the intelligence side or true offense side means you are tasked with understanding who is these organizations like these ISIS, what's their organization structure, what are they trying to do, and finding the path of least resistance and the right way to gain the needed intelligence to drive this operation. I can share from personal experience that when an entity like Iran targets these critical infrastructure of this country, or when these Russian mafia is targeting these large enterprise for either intellectual property or for financial motives, they run the following playbook, which will be the main theme for today, which is understanding what the org structure of this enterprise is to find these departments and subsidiaries that don't have very strong security procedures, capabilities. Then they would look for these systems and things that are exposed to the internet and are most vulnerable. And then they will exploit these to gain access to these internal networks and data. So having spent so many years in those realms taught me and our team here how attackers do it and the power of the path of least resistance, why it's so important to address it. And that's why we started CyCognito 5.5 years ago to help security teams understand how their attack surface really looks like from an attacker's perspective and find the 3 or 5 or 15 ways to breach their networks and data right now and prevent breaches by understanding and eliminating these critical attack paths. So today we're going to talk about a question that I'm being asked a lot by various security leaders and others, which is, why is this domain so important right now? It seems like more and more people are talking about it every day: attack surface protection, attack surface security. And number 2, what are the top few requirements to operationalize such a program versus just do something, which often doesn't work? So we'll start by talking about the element, the entity that is actually generating the risk. If you want to protect yourselves from anything, obviously the first thing to understand is who's standing in front of you. What is this risk about? And there are a couple of between misconceptions to elements that are not as intuitive that are useful to start from. So number 1, threat actors like, say, these Russian mafia that is just trying to make some money. These kind of entities don't get medals for doing something, quote unquote, properly. they could not care less about whether their target is compliant with ISO or NIST or MITRE or what have you. They also, in a sense, don't really care about what security controls they have in place, what processes they have in place. The only thing they care about is achieving their mission, which is usually getting access to certain networks or data and do something with that. So the first key takeaway that seems extremely logical and simple, yet is not how many aspects in our industry work, is the risk and the breach prevention is, quote unquote, the one thing to really worry about, and the thing you want all of your programs and procedures and so on to be based on. It's impossible to prevent huge damage if attackers steal your customers' credentials and financial data and so on, or your core intellectual property, if you're a huge company that invests billions developing that intellectual property. So you always want to have that as where you're starting from when you build your program. The second element that is really interesting and a bit counterintuitive is that there are security theaters in cybersecurity, and they're actually very inviting threat actors. So what are security theaters? So this is a concept that was first discussed with respect to airports security, in the sense of we're investing these billions of dollars in TSA and other things, and yet it's not that difficult to buy a truck and run over the fences of this airport. It's a troubling thought, but it's very true, and it's also true in cybersecurity. For example, what if I believe in zero trust and I invest millions of dollars and whole teams in implementing zero trust, but like most enterprises, I only deploy zero trust in half of my authentication mechanisms. I talked to a CISO a couple of years ago that the organization got breached. It's a Fortune 500 company. It's actually bigger, but let's keep it as a Fortune 500 company. And they said, hey, we are using one of the top, actually the top identity management solution, and we got breached because of stolen credentials. How the hell did that happen? And when we onboarded them on our platform, we found that they deployed that technology only in a few authentication mechanisms, and the vast majority of them, hundreds of them, were not protected in any way. So security theater mean I'm protecting very well some areas. It makes me feel very good about my security posture. Maybe I'm reporting to the board or to others about how great it is. But if I'm an attacker, I'm actually very glad that this entity is happy with their security posture, because it actually provides all of these opportunities to me. Which leads to the next super important concept, maybe the most important concept we'll discuss today, which is path of least resistance. And that's the principle, from my perspective, behind attack surface management, attack surface protection. So if you ask most analysts today, and even CEOs and leaders at endpoint companies and incident response companies and others, they'll tell you that most breaches today are attributed to unknown and unmanaged assets. Meaning, companies invest millions of dollars, in some cases, $1 billion, but these even $1 billion really protect these, call it 70 or 80% of the assets, data, attack surface. And there can be 20% of the attack surface that is not well monitored or protected. Sometimes not at all. We had a case with one of the biggest banks in the world where they had a marketing company building these sort of marketing website for them. They were selling these dreamy vacations to millionaire customers they had. And these customers were invited to log into that website and buy these vacations at a discount, but they had to log in. Now, that marketing company built that authentication mechanism in a flawed way. So they had an SQL injection vulnerability that allowed attackers to steal the credentials of all of these millionaires. And the security team was not aware of the existence of that website, which a third party created for their marketing organization. And by the way, these credentials that these millionaires have used there were probably used everywhere else. So it's the perfect waterhole attack that this bank has sort of set up against their top customers, obviously without understanding that's what's happening. So that's just one interesting example for why breaches or more and more breaches are attributed to such unknown and unmanaged assets. It's so much easier to attack these banks' customers through such a website versus the 10 servers, machines, applications considered crown jewels, where this $1 billion of cybersecurity investment is invested in. 1,000 times easier. And the other point that is really interesting is that we're seeing that attackers are becoming much more efficient and effective at finding these unknown and unmanaged assets and weak spots, blind spots. In fact, CISA and DHS released these paper or what have you a year ago that said it takes on average 48 hours for attackers from the moment that a new CVE is published until these CVE or vulnerabilities being exploited in the wild, on average. Now, the mean time to remediation of most organizations is in the months. Even critical risk, even at Fortune 100 and Fortune 10 companies. So what does that tell us? That tells us that we have to focus on these blind spots. That's where the risk really is today. And we have to act super fast one way or another on that risk. So that brings us to how do organizations tackle this problem today? The attack surface protection, outside-in cyber risk problem. So let's talk about these 3 levels of maturity. The first level, the first type, which is a bit counterintuitive, and I'll explain why in a second, because we have maybe 2 subtypes here, is focus on specific bad IPs and bad URLs, mostly passively, investigating them manually, and essentially being focused on what's under the lamplight. So it usually works like the following. You have a security rating solution, or sometimes even your customer tells you, hey, here's a random bad IP that seems to be owned by you and seems to be vulnerable. Please do something about it. And then your SecOps team would need to investigate, is this IP address even ours? What the heck is this? Is it important? Is it vulnerable? And if the answer to these questions is yes, then they would act on it. By the way, when doing these investigations manually, we've learned that even the most sophisticated organizations in the world spend between 5 to 10 hours of net time per asset to investigate. And they spend weeks, sometimes months on the calendar to run this, because sometimes they would need to reach out to this subsidiary. Is that yours? It seems to be related to your business. They would need to reach out to other people. Maybe it's someone who left the company. So quite painful. And that's how, by the way, 99% of the enterprises have done attack surface management until the last year or two. There is another subcategory here of homegrown solutions where over time, and interestingly enough, it's especially very large, very sophisticated organizations that 5-8 years ago said, oh, there's way too much noise. Let's build some scripts that will help us save time. So also in this category, you have some companies that look at certain databases, mostly things like Shodan. So they would look at known IP ranges. Here are the few IP ranges I'm aware of, and I right now believe that I care about, and I'll download this Shodan data every day and look for these 1,000 odd ports proactively. And if I find that port, then I will start the manual asset investigation. So what it gives you is I can eliminate or I can investigate some security gaps in my external attack surface, but it's by and large passive, and I don't discover net new networks and applications I didn't know about. For example, there's no way for this approach to find that marketing website that is exposing my top customers' credentials and financial information. And in a sense, approach number one, or maturity level number one, is the 5-7 years, 10 years old approach to external attack surface management. Level number two was born over the last, call it 5 years gradually. And now there are probably at least hundreds, if not 1,000, maybe 2,000 companies out there that are using this approach. And it's an external attack surface management product or some automated process at some level. The vast majority, if not all, of the processes/solutions in this category are still seeded, meaning they do require the IP ranges and domain names you know about, and they will find some new networks and applications you didn't know about that are directly related. That's the point. They're directly related to that IP range that you already know about. And they'll do a basic assessment, mainly port scanning. So they'll tell you what open ports exist there and what services and software versions exist there. They'll do it automatically and at an enterprise grade. So much better than doing this using scripts or not doing it at all or in a completely passive way. But it leaves very big gaps in both discovery and assessment. And I'll share a couple of examples. When we onboarded a Fortune 100 insurance company, which was using such a solution from the maybe biggest vendor in this industry, they knew about just 50 out of their 260 subsidiaries and departments and only half of their attack surface. So even though they're highly regulated, they have a great team, by the way, and they were trying to do the right thing. These kind of technologies that require seeds and don't go deep enough, and we'll talk about the requirements in a second, but will leave huge gaps in the attack surface, and 80% of the critical risk found was found in the other 50% of the attack surface that they did not know about, which completely supports, obviously, the path of least resistance principle. So now you're investing more resources, in installing more locks on the front door of this building, but the back door is unlocked and is just becoming more and more attractive to attackers relatively. And guess what is going to be targeted by attackers? Basic logic. So this is an improvement over the super legacy approach, the passive / scripts based approach, but leaves so many gaps and in a sense creates or enhances the security theater situation that is really not recommended or great. And the third maturity level / third approach is thinking about and operationalizing this based on a risk life cycle. So first off, we're talking about deep discovery. In the requirements, we'll talk about that in a second, but essentially it means solving the problems that existed for a decade in this area around understanding the org structure, understanding what's really exposed, finding these blind spots that would otherwise require manual reconnaissance process that, by the way, from personal experience, I can tell you, even the best reconnaissance teams in the world, if you give them a company name or an organization name, it can easily take many months to run a one point in time assessment of the attack surface of this company. So this has to be obviously automated. And then the second element that is super important here is the risk visibility. And that means, say that I have full visibility to this company's attack surface. Amazing. Now, if I'm not testing and looking for risk everywhere, or if I'm still unaware for whatever reason of a lot of the risk, I haven't done anything. Visibility is super important, but it's really an enabler for risk management. There is no inherent value in getting more visibility or asset visibility without the risk visibility, if you will. And in terms of how you measure yourself in these three categories, and that's another question that I get a lot and a lovely conversation to have. I'm thinking about it, and we are thinking about it in these couple of main terms. First one is, which is slightly tricky, visibility percentage. And it's tricky because it's an unknowns problem. But how frequently do you randomly find new assets that are yours and vulnerable? If it happens every week or month, you're probably not at a great spot. Or if someone tells you about the fact that your attack surface is twice as large as what you thought that it is, that's a big problem. The second key metric is security testing coverage. So what percentage of my web applications are actually getting tested? So if I have tens of thousands of web interfaces exposed to the internet, and today every DevOps solution, by the way, is a web interface that can be exposed to the internet, and some breaches and early attacks start from such cases. So if I have these even 1,000 web interfaces exposed to the internet, how many of them are being tested with my pen testing solution? And the third key metric is mean time to remediation. As we shared earlier, CISA and DHS say it takes 48 hours on average to exploit new vulnerabilities. If my mean time to remediation is in the months, even for critical risk, then I'm quite far off, and I need to look into what's hindering my process from getting to where it's supposed to be, which is ideally no more than a few days, which is absolutely possible today, especially with a risk management-oriented approach. So I bet that the third approach sounds great and sounds like it's supposed to sound like the right thing to do. And there's now a lot of evidence that it indeed is. And that brings us to the main question and the main topic for today, which is, what are the key requirements to get a risk-oriented or operationalized attack surface management in a risk-oriented way? So I really manage my risk, I reduce my risk, I rule my risk. And there are 5 main requirements, and we're going to deep dive into each of them in 1 second. And these 5 requirements are organization mapping or reconnaissance, asset discovery and contextualization, active security testing, risk prioritization, and then, of course, accelerated remediation. And you can think about this, by the way, as a funnel that starts from the mapping, contextualization, and goes through the next pieces. And the interesting thing about a funnel, any funnel model, is if I have a perfect remediation process, but I'm unaware of half of my organization or half of my risk and vulnerabilities, then I'm not going to do very well. I can make myself feel like I'm doing well, speaking of security theater, but if I'm asking myself the tough, hairy questions, how can I tell that I know my attack surface? How do I challenge my knowledge about it? Then I may figure out that, oh, I have potentially tons of risk that I'm unaware of even, and I can't manage very well. We have a customer that was using a seeded EASM solution, one of the most common ones, for a few years. They were design partners, and here's how they portrayed these few years of maturity, by the way, which I think adds value in this context. They said, before we used that other solution, we didn't even know that we have a problem. We thought that we know our attack surface. Then we started to get to have these incidents and what have you, and we were looking for some solutions. We started to work with this other company, and they showed us more attack surface we didn't know about, and we moved from unknown unknowns, not knowing we have a problem even, to known unknowns, because now they showed us we have a problem, but we could not operationalize the risk life cycle, which they wanted to do from day one, which is good for them, but they could not do that. And then in this case with CyCognito, they were able to go to known knowns, understanding what the assets are, understanding where the risk is, and being able to remediate and prevent breaches and reduce risk. So what are these requirements? Why does this make sense? Requirement number 1, organization mapping. So the idea here is, if I don't know my org structure well, including even things like brands and services, there is literally no logical way I can find my whole attack surface. For example, if I have these 500 subsidiaries and 200 brands, and each of these subsidiaries and brands has between 10 to 1,000 web interfaces exposed to the internet. The ones I don't know about are and therefore not monitor are much more likely to become that path of least resistance. So if I use a seeded EASM solution, for example, that only looks at the IP ranges of my corporate network, what's going to be the result? I'm going to feel really good, probably, because the corporate network is usually managed much better than the rest of the organization. But what about the risk aspect? From a risk aspect, I might be in a really bad position But if I don't even know, like that insurance company, if I don't even know about some of my subsidiaries, departments, acquisitions, brands, services, I can't provide an input to the quote unquote tool to protect that, to monitor that for me. So that's why this is so critical. And that's another area that is not very well understood. It's super clear to people who have done offense, or even some people who have done black box penetration testing, because that's how you start. But it's the exact opposite approach of how vulnerability management and standard pen testing were done in the last 25 years. These vendors always start and finish with, tell me about your IP ranges and I'll scan them or something. So that's how we got used as an industry to approach risk assessment, vulnerability management, if you will, thinking about IP ranges that we know and manage and control. But that approach has nothing to do with how risk is created and how threat actors do their thing. So if we don't want to ignore how risk takes place, we have to address this, and it has to be automated too, probably, especially in a large enterprise. If you're a small coffee shop, you don't need to worry about it. If you're a large enterprise, you definitely do. So after we have these, in some cases, hundreds, and in some cases, even thousands of subsidiaries, department, brands, and so on, you can then look for the applications, machines, SSL certificates, and even files and directories and other things exposed to the internet that are related to these organizations. Now, when you think about the first two levels of maturity we talked about and compare it with the third one of the biggest differences here is the following. The legacy approach was, again, tell us about the IP ranges and domain names, and we'll tell you something about it. And that something about it was really open ports and services. Nmap was invented somewhere in the mid-90s, and essentially Nmap and that core technology is still how most of these solutions work to this day in 2023. Now, what ports and services don't tell you about is many key elements that are critical for risk management. First and foremost, what is this asset? For example, in one of the biggest integrators, IT integrators in the world, we've found an internal ticketing system that exposed PII and a lot of support kind of information like serial numbers and many sensitive things. Now, an internal ticketing system would not be defined in any company I know as a crown jewel. It's just another tool the company is using, right? And internally. But when it's exposed, it becomes the number one target for attackers that can find it. So to find that asset and understand its essence, it has nothing to do with an IP port and CPE/service name or software version. It's only related to its content and purpose. In one of the biggest energy companies, we found an exposed oil pumps system exposed to the internet just days after the Colonial Pipeline breach, by the way. And any attacker that would have found it could shut down some of these systems without any problem and without even any exploit, by the way. Again, when you have an OT exposed system, it has nothing to do with an open port. you would see simply an open 80 or 443 port, the most common ports in the world. So the legacy approach would tell you absolutely nothing about that asset. So definitely not enough. A couple of other key elements here that are critical for operationalizing EASM are elements like ownership and attribution. If I had to put my finger on the number one pain, or one of the top 2 or 3 pain points of organizations that tried to operationalize EASM, especially with the second category we talked about, is attribution. So you find some new assets, you spend time investigating them manually, so you figure out, oh, it's related to my company, and it seems to be important, and it seems to be vulnerable, but who owns the asset? And the counterintuitive thing about external attack surface, unlike internal attack surface, is anyone in the world potentially could be the admin of that application or machine. It can be a third-party company. It can be this department in Singapore or France, and these people that you never talk to. So understanding who owns the asset and attributing it to at least the department or organization is super critical, especially at scale. By the way, today that is possible using machine learning and NLP. I'll give you a quick example. Say that this large integrator has this Cisco gateway that they own. It's deployed on their IP range with their SSL certificate, but it provides access to your internal network. So an attacker, if they would see this web page of that Cisco solution, they would see this drop-down list of network names. And even in the title of the page, it would usually say, this is a gateway to company access network or something. So an attacker could understand this asset is owned by the integrator, but it provides access to this company's internal network. And if it's exposed and vulnerable, it's a perfect attack path. But what if whatever technology and process are being in use, what if I don't know all of the subsidiaries, departments, brands, names? And so I can't use these data points to look for assets out there in the world that are related to these organizations. So I can't find the asset. And then if I don't have NLP capabilities that can extract these entities, make that correlation, so I can understand, Rob, maybe you don't own the asset yourself, but it's related to you. It's affecting your security posture. It's vulnerable. You should know about it, probably do something about it. So that's where context is so important in any industry, in any problem, by the way, definitely here, definitely at scale. And as I mentioned earlier, when it takes 10 hours to do this per asset and requires some expertise, and you have tens of thousands or millions of assets exposed to the internet, doing this manually is simply not going to work and mathematically cannot work or scale. Moving forward to the third key requirement, active security testing. And this one is quite counterintuitive too. So if we look again at the legacy approach to security testing, risk assessment of the last 25 years, these tools and vendors told us, hey, running, say, dynamic application security testing is going to cost you millions of dollars for these 50 applications, and you choose what 50 applications you want to cover. Now, you really have 10,000 web interfaces exposed to the internet, and even free tools like Burp Suite still require you to feed them with URLs, run them for hours and days. Then they would throw at you hundreds of potential issues, and you would need to manually validate them. So it simply cannot scale in any company. Not even the big banks and others who spend north than $1 billion in cybersecurity. No one is testing that, at least we've ever talked to, is testing more than, call it, hundreds of applications and web interfaces thoroughly. It's impossible to do with manual tools or legacy tools. However, if I'm testing just 1, 5, 10% of my web applications, which ones over time are going to accumulate most of the risk? The other 90%. And same goes with penetration testing that could find things like weak credentials on this SSH service or SaaS application, and data exposure. And that's why running active security testing, not just passive security testing, which is really port scanning, that's why it's so critical. Another Fortune 100 financial institution, for example, had, just like so many others, they had this directory on AWS exposed to the internet with a bash history file that had dozens of MySQL credentials in it. Again, no one would call this random bash history file the crown jewel of the company, yet it enabled attackers to run direct attacks on a bunch of exposed assets. And can I run pen testing on millions or even thousands of assets? No. So at least I've never heard anyone saying that's possible. So I assume at this point it's impossible. So coverage is extremely important. Modern technologies should allow you to test everything, but not only in terms of coverage, also in terms of the testing cadence. That means, say that I have this wonderful pen testing or red team in my company, or I'm hiring these pen testers who are so awesome and they run perfect pen testing. Excellent. Now, even with respect to the assets they are testing, which is probably less than 1% of what's exposed to the internet, they are testing these assets probably on an annual basis, once a year. In the best case scenario, once a quarter. What does that mean in terms of risk management? That means attackers have between 3 to 12 months, even on the assets I am properly testing, to find new vulnerabilities and exploit them. So in terms of risk management, I need complete coverage, and I want to test these assets ideally on a daily basis, or at least on a weekly, bi-weekly basis. And it has to be active testing, because port scanning and passive testing can't detect the vast majority of the risk. One insurance company that provides cyber insurance solutions mentioned that around 95% of the vulnerabilities that lead to breaches in their research, that's their intellectual property, 95% of these vulnerabilities cannot be detected with the passive approach, with port scanning and similar technologies, which is also why, by the way, cyber insurance is losing a lot of money. So they're also actively looking for better ways to do it, to set premiums and help you guys more. Getting to the last two requirements now that are, I think, more straightforward. Prioritization is obviously super important. What's not super obvious is, how do I get from looking at 5,000 critical vulnerabilities that some large enterprises see and get from these vulnerability scanners to focus on the top 10. And coming from the offensive security side of the house, what was obvious to us was there aren't thousands of opportunities to breach this organization. There are really maybe 3 or 10 or 20 good ones, even in the biggest companies. Now, as an attacker, what these opportunities are: important assets in terms of the data they store or the access they can provide that are exploitable, that I can obviously find. Now, when you think about, if you look at my previous examples, if you think about that bash history file or these oil pumps OT solution, or that marketing website that is exposing the top bank's customers' credentials, or other such things. There aren't thousands of these in this company. And the question is, how do you find them and prioritize them properly? So what we strongly believe in is the context. The couple of missing gaps are: 1, context on this asset. If I look at IP addresses and ports, I will never get to the point where I can prioritize the top 10. And then it's exploitability and threat intelligence, probably paid threat intelligence, about what's exploitable and what's being exploited in the wild. When you do that, and now we can speak based on a lot of evidence, even Fortune 10, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies can go from the thousands of critical issues to just 10 or 20. It's this context primarily on what these things are, what's super important and exposed to attackers. And that's very good news. And the last piece is, of course, the actual remediation. In this area, what you want to measure is, of course, mean time to remediation. So from the moment I detect the risk, how much time it takes to remediate it. Now, one belief in the industry is that the biggest pain point here is the patching. And many people, in any case, ask me, hey, is automated patching possible? And my answer always is, in some cases you can automate patching, but in many cases where you're talking about critical risk, it's a configuration change of a critical system, or sometimes a code change. Sometimes you need this other subsidiary to make the change. So you can't always automate the patching per se. And it's not terrible, by the way, at all, when you're looking at 10 critical vulnerabilities versus thousands. So first off, great prioritization solves a lot of these problems. The other thing I tell them is, look, from our years of experience now with 20 of the global 100 companies that are our customers and so many others, 90% of the pain is actually in what's taking place before the actual patching. It's in finding these problems, validating that the risk is truly there, getting the evidence that the risk exists, which, by the way, again, goes back to active security testing. If I'm running passive security testing and it's all just ports and unvalidated CVEs, then IT ops is going to tell me, or this subsidiary is going to tell me, Rob, you're wasting our time. Versus if I have evidence on, I got this response from this machine, therefore there is 99% chance it is exploitable to this. By the way, here's the exploit. You can try it by yourself if you like. Now, here are the remediation steps. Go and run this patch. that removes the vast majority of the pain. It's not the actual click on the patch that is the main problem, it seems like. It's how do I prove that the asset is yours, that the risk exists, that threat actors are exploiting this in the wild. That's the why it's critical to remediate this right now. And then what the remediation steps are. And last but not least, I'll mention that modern technologies can also provide automated remediation validation capabilities. So you don't have to call someone or run another scan. The system will tell you, now it's resolved. So there you have the external attack surface risk management lifecycle, the way it's supposed to work, and the way that now hundreds of companies learn that it should and can work well. And we also covered a little bit about what's not working, what are the pain points with some legacy approaches / more basic approaches to this problem. The problem seems to be getting worse as the attack surfaces expand. And that's why we really enjoy spending time with security teams and learning more, sharing more, solving these problems. And yeah, super interesting domain. With that, maybe before Ryan chimes in, I'll mention that we recommend checking out our website and some of the resources about how to assess whether this area is a gap or a challenge for your team organization, and what's working for these 20 of the global 100 companies and so many other enterprises with CyCognito. Please do share with us your questions and anything that you'd like us to discuss. We will do a separate session on that. Thank you everyone for spending some time with us, and looking forward to connecting and learning and sharing more. Have a good one. Bye-bye.